Okay guys, we are finishing up chapter 7. This is the part 3 video that's going to deal with logical fallacies. It's a little bit different than the other videos, so bear with me as I shift formats partway through. A logical fallacy is essentially, it's a piece of evidence or a piece of logic that's being used to support an argument that's not really supportive or not really very strong. It's a flaw in the argument, something that is false, right? That's where fallacy comes from, the word false. A fallacy often seems logical at first, but when you really examine it more closely, it tends to fall apart. So it's important that as good critical thinkers, you are able to identify fallacies in arguments. Not just arguments that you're reading, but arguments that you may be engaging in other formats too. Things that you hear on television, or things that you hear celebrities say, or things that you read on social media, or conversations that you have with your family or your coworkers. Fallacies are all over the place. So we are going to go through some different examples of fallacies. You don't have to memorize this whole list, but you will have to identify some fallacies on the quiz, where there will be like a little paragraph and you'll have to say, well, this is an example of the false cause fallacy or the appeal to force fallacy. So I want to walk you through each one of these, and instead of doing it obviously in a classroom, in an interactive like question and answer format, I am going to use, sorry, I have to restart this. I'm going to use an old presentation that I created and that I used to use. So we are going to be talking about fallacies today. Each one of these has an example. Some of them have videos. I won't have time in today's screencast to show you all the videos, but I'm going to post a link to this presentation along with this video so that you can go back if you want to and review the videos yourself to help you understand each one of these fallacies a little bit better. So we'll start with the ad hominem fallacy, which is an attack on the person who is making the argument instead of arguing specifically about the issue itself. So if you look at these examples, both of these are ad hominem fallacies. An appeal to force fallacy is the use of intimidation, trying to scare someone into agreeing with you or voting for you. This is a video actually, if you click on the link and want to view this video later. So that will help you explain the appeal to force fallacy. Appeal to the masses is also known as the bandwagon fallacy, and it's essentially just claiming that because lots of people believe this, it must be true, which we know is not a strong argument or piece of evidence, right? So we have to be better critical thinkers than that. Arguing from ignorance is claiming that just because there's no information out there to prove a statement wrong, that doesn't make it right. So for example, saying you can't prove that ghosts don't exist, so you should conclude that they do, is an example of the arguing from ignorance fallacy. The burden of proof fallacy is when somebody makes a claim, but then instead of providing evidence to prove their claim, they simply tell you that it's your job to prove them wrong. But that's not the way arguments work, right? The burden of proof rests on the person who's making the claim. So these are a couple of examples down here of that burden of proof fallacy. Begging the question, or circular reasoning, is another type of fallacy in which the original argument just simply restates or rephrases the claim in a different way. It doesn't actually give any evidence or support. So this example over here, the napkin religion is the one true religion because it says so right here on this napkin. You can see how that's circular reasoning. Right? It doesn't actually go anywhere. It just goes around and around in circles, and it doesn't actually provide any evidence or support to prove this claim as true. Complex or loaded questions are fallacies sometimes. Asking a loaded question essentially is based on an assumption, right? So instead of asking the obvious question, we sort of lead our audience into believing something by asking what we call these complex questions. Do you feel better now that you're no longer a complete idiot? Is an example of a loaded question. You're completely skipping over the question of whether or not this person is or is not an idiot, and you're simply just making the assumption that they are and then asking them a question. Why are kids so lazy these days precludes the idea that they are lazy. And what did you do with the DVDs you took from me? Obviously assumes that this person does take the DVD or has taken the DVDs. So you can see that all of these questions are based on assumptions. These are called complex questions. The either-or fallacy pushes the audience into a box where they have to choose either A or B, and it tends to ignore all of the other possible options. So this ad for Palm is assuming that if you don't choose their product, the only alternative is utter chaos, which obviously is not the truth, right? There are a lot of options out there for ways that you could organize your life, but they want you to believe that these are their two choices because that makes them seem like the better choice. This example on the right is actually a quote from a student in one of my classes who was doing a debate on the death penalty. And she said, I don't want to get rid of the death penalty because I don't like my taxpayers paying for murderers to work out in the gym and watch, HBO on TV all day. So I think it's important to recognize that there are other options here, right? You could reform the prison system. You could make it impossible for them to have HBO if that's what you want. You could change the way prisons are financed. You could ask them to fundraise instead of providing state funds. There are a lot of things that you could do, but she's setting up the either-or fallacy that you either have to A, let them have gyms and HBO, or B, kill them, when obviously there are more options than that. A false analogy is, we talked in chapter 6 about how an analogy is a comparison, and we can use that in support of an argument as a piece of evidence, but it's important to make sure that the comparison that you're making is valid. So in this example, the analogy is not, they're not really comparing two things that are very, very similar. Saying I didn't have a smartphone when I was in high school and I survived, so there's no reason that high schoolers today, have to have smartphones. That is a false analogy. The whole world is completely different now than when it was when you were in high school. So there are big differences. This is not a direct comparison. So it's an example of the false analogy. This video does a really great job of explaining false analogy, so I will let you review that on your own. False authority is when you use testimonials from someone who's not an expert in a particular field. We did talk about earlier in this chapter, as a matter of fact, about expert opinions, when you're providing a testimonial from someone whose education or experience really, lends them some credibility on the topic. So false authority is when you are using a testimonial from someone who really is not an expert. This is another video. This is actually a commercial, but it does a good job of illustrating false authority. Post hoc, sometimes called false cause, is when you assume that two ideas, because they are related to one another, or because one of them happened before the other one, that the first event caused the second event, right? So just because two things are related does not necessarily mean that one of them causes the other one. So the superstition that every time I wear my favorite shirt, my team wins, does not necessarily lead you to the conclusion that your t-shirt is the reason that they've won. There's a video here. The second part of this video does a good job of explaining the post hoc or false cause fallacy. Related to that is mistaking correlation for causation. Correlation just means relatedness, and causation means that something is causing the other. So just because two things are related, that does not mean that one of them causes the other. The example here, oh, I don't know what just happened. Sorry. The example here is saying the deadly facts about water, right? 100% of all serial killers, rapists, and drug dealers have admitted to drinking water. Water is one of the leading causes of drowning, and 100% of all people exposed to water will die. So just because it's true that 100% of all people exposed to water will die, that does not mean that water is the cause of that. So this is a related fallacy to the post hoc fallacy that we just talked about. Guilt by association is a fallacy where you're trying to discredit the person who is arguing against you or the argument itself by linking it to someone who the public typically doesn't respect or like very much. This billboard says, "I still believe in global warming, do you?" And it's essentially saying that the Unabomber believes in global warming. And the implication here is that, you know, do you really want to share the same belief as this, you know, crazy person? So I think that this is a fallacy that people use a lot, and you have to really be able to separate out the belief from the person or from their behavior. A hasty generalization is when you are making a generalization or lumping things together in a way that does not provide a lot of differentiation. So it's when you're basing something on too little evidence or evidence of a small sample that doesn't represent the whole. Hasty generalization happens when we have inadequate sample size or stereotyping. So saying something like, you know, all millennials are lazy just because maybe you've met 2 millennials and you think that they're lazy, that's a hasty generalization. It's a fallacy. It's not a piece of strong evidence. So this is an ad, video ad that also illustrates this concept. Moving the goalposts is a fallacy where you are requiring more and more evidence in order to prove a point. So essentially you have to allow your argument to kind of hit its natural endpoint instead of keep asking for more and more evidence. Sorry, I lost where I was. The naturalistic fallacy is an assumption that just because something is natural, that makes it automatically good or healthy. We know that that's not always true. Then we have the red herring fallacy, which is when we use irrelevant evidence to overwhelm or confuse our audience or sort of get in the way, make them forget what they were originally asking. This video debate actually does a really good job of kind of illustrating how a red herring fallacy works. It just distracts the audience or diverts the attention. And finally, the slippery slope fallacy is when we assume that just because one thing happens, then there will be a chain of events that leads us to a conclusion that we don't want, right? So this ad is one of those cable ads. It's like get rid of cable or, you know, else. So it's a good illustration of this fallacy as well. This is a fallacy because obviously we can't guarantee what will happen. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is our last fallacy, the straw man fallacy. It's basically just building up kind of a silly argument so that you can easily discredit it.